Hi, listeners. Welcome to the Grief Out Loud podcast produced by the Dougie Center for Grieving Children. I'm Janet DeCristofaro and wanted to give you just a little heads up as you listen to this episode. You'll be hearing references to our old name, which was Dear Dougie. So just so you don't get too confused, you're listening to the right podcast, and we look forward to bringing you even more great content under the Grief Out Loud name. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Dear Dougie podcast, produced by the Dougie Center for Grieving Children in Portland, Oregon. I am Brendan Connolly.
And I'm Janet DeCristofaro. Thank you so much for listening today to this episode. The Dear Dougie podcast came out of our thoughts around that, we've been working with grieving kids and teens and adults for a little over 30 years now. And after listening to their stories of what works for them, what doesn't work for them, we wanted a chance to share what we've learned from them with the larger community. So our podcast is really just a way to open up the often avoided conversation about grief. It's not something people talk about easily. And while we all experience loss during our lives, most of us find ourselves not sure what to do when that actually happens. We don't know how to feel, how to talk about it, or what to do. So whether you're grieving a loss or you're in a position of wanting to support someone who is, this podcast is for you.
So I guess we're talking about the changing of seasons and the effect that has on grieving people. Is that right?
That's right. It's been coming up a lot in groups these last few weeks, because here in Portland, we're charging full force into spring. And while those of you maybe who are listening on the East Coast or maybe in the middle of the country, spring may seem very distant, here in Oregon, we've got it happening. People have been talking a lot about how, not just in spring, but how as the seasons begin to change, things that they notice for themselves with their grief, and how oftentimes the change of the season can be hard.
Yeah. It is beautiful outside today here. It's one of those days where the air is a little brisk and the sun is shining, and I just love it. I mean, we get a lot of rain, and so we got to really celebrate the sun when we get it.
And that can be what's hard for people who are grieving. And, there's so many markers connected to grief throughout the year, whether it's the approach of an anniversary of a loss or a birthday or some other sort of holiday special occasion. The seasons can be a little bit more amorphous, right? Like spring is coming. There may be associations with spring that somebody who's grieving has with the person who died, special traditions that they shared. And then in a bigger perspective, there can be, as you mentioned, like the excitement for spring and the looking forward to better weather, and maybe, connecting more with people kind of coming out of the hibernation of winter. And people who are grieving, not everyone, but for some people, it can be a really hard contrast. Everyone else is moving forward and getting excited, and you're sitting with being sad and not feeling so great about being more out and about in the world.
Yeah, and we're kind of talking about the overarching theme of environmental season changes, but I guess that also applies to all the other kinds of cyclical events that happen in a year, whether if that's sports seasons or gardening seasons or whatever it is, holiday seasons. And we did talk about holidays in an earlier podcast a little bit. That all kind of ties into it, I suppose, right?
Right. And then you've got the calendar, right? That's telling you spring break, like our spring break is coming up next week. So the calendar says spring break is coming, but then you've got all the environmental cues of longer days, flowers are blooming, the weather's changing, the way the air feels, and all of those things can contribute to memories and emotions getting jostled again. And it can be tricky when you're grieving, because sometimes those things they're not so clear, right? You don't look at your phone and say, oh, the 18th, that's, 6 months since my mom died. But you're like, why am I feeling a little extra cranky or extra tired, or what's actually happening? And then to remember, like, oh yeah, when I got the call that my mom's cancer was terminal, that there was nothing else that we could do. I remember looking out the window and seeing that the tulips had just bloomed.
Yeah.
So there can be this association that's not always so conscious for people.
So on a broad scale, in groups, are there cues that are used to help people think through all the feels they have around seasonal changes?
Well, I think for a lot of people, it's just coming to group and being able to talk about these things. Like, am I losing my mind? Like, does anyone else have this going on? Like, I really don't like spring, or I'm not looking forward to spring, and I feel like an imposter, especially here in Portland, because people are kind of going off the rails with their excitement
Yeah.
about outdoor times. So just having that connection, be like, nope, you are not alone. That happens for me too. And then to bring it down into the specific for them of what are the associations they have with any particular season and the person who
Hmm.
died. I think you and I were talking a story about your grandfather and surfing, and
Yeah, oh yeah, my uncle. Yeah, I that's definitely true. I know my uncle was really instrumental in to me as I was learning to surf as a young guy, and I have great memories of that. And when I surf in Oregon, it's often kind of cloudy and rainy and wet, and I don't necessarily give my uncle a lot of thought during those days. But on the days when it's really bright and sunny, irrespective of the time of year, it just really pulls my mind back to sunny, warm summer days at Malibu with my uncle, on little waves on a longboard, and it's just it really is about the what's going on outside that makes my mind turn to that.
to connect with that. And it
Yeah,
sounds like for you in this situation, it's a pretty positive
yeah,
experience
yeah.
of reconnecting with those memories. And I think when we hear in groups, are people sort of getting in that place of they're not so sure yet. And that's a positive memory because it kind of catches them off guard.
Yeah,
And so that process of making it more conscious and that connection and maybe even anticipating or planning for it can
mm,
sometimes help shift it into a place that feels less scary and unpredictable. So that can involve thinking through like what role did that person play in my life during any particular season.
yeah,
For kids, this can be especially true because seasons are so connected to school and their calendar and the activities that they're doing, like you mentioned, sports season.
yep.
So just thinking through that for people of, I always went fishing on the first day of fishing season with my grandfather. This is the first year fishing season's coming. Do I want to go fishing? Who can I go with? Do I want to go by myself?
Yeah,
So being able to just think through that can sometimes lessen that unexpected
yeah,
experience.
yeah. And that ties into some stuff I think you talked about on an earlier podcast episode where you were sort of explaining, if I remember this right, how families can have traditions within their family units, large or small, and when someone dies, sometimes the things that they did, maybe they cooked the turkey at dinner time, at Thanksgiving, or they put the lights up out on the house, and when the person dies, then the family has to kind of think about and renegotiate those traditional roles, right?
Exactly. And not, and everyone in the family might have, there might be something specific, right? Like grandma always cooked the turkey at
Mm-hmm.
Thanksgiving, but there may be individual ones that people in the family aren't aware of for one another. So it can be helpful, especially with kids and teens, to ask them, what are the things you're thinking about as we get ready for summer coming or the fall?
Yeah,
What are the things that were really special that you shared with dad? And maybe someone's kind of worried because dad was who always helped them get ready for their softball games,
yeah.
hit them grounders and all of that. And like, so that way the kids aren't having to worry about that on their own. Someone else is helping them figure out what to do instead.
So those are good kind of higher level ways to think about it. You talked about associations and you talked about roles a person played and traditions you want to keep or kind of rethink. But what about with specific environmental seasons? Spring, summer, fall, and winter. Are there kind of stereotypes around that or expectations around that play out in grief?
Definitely. And what's interesting is when I think of going through each of the seasons, like part of that is for people who are grieving, but especially for those who are listening who are in the role of being a support person, can be really helpful to kind of have this on your radar. Because a lot of the things associated with each of these seasons are considered to be positive
Uh
experiences,
huh.
things to be excited about, and to always be remembering when someone's grieving, there may be a shadow side of that. So, like here we've got spring coming. So, people going outside, leaving winter hibernation. There's this real immersion in the idea of growth and change. And for people who are grieving, there may be a real longing to change their experience of grief, but there can also be the what am I leaving behind
Yeah.
if I change? And then the big one that's coming up in our groups a lot right now is
Yes.
graduations. high school, college. That's people talking a lot about that. So if you're in a role of supporting someone, you might be reaching out to your friend or to your family member and say, hey, I know Steven's high school graduation is coming up.
Yep.
What's going on for you around that? How can I be helpful to you?
Yep.
And then, we got summer, and I'm not sure what's a big thing for your family in summer, but for a lot of people, got trips, outdoor activities, and then kids being out of school. For a lot of
Yeah.
kids, not some kids go to year-round school, but for kids coming out of school, there can be a lot of ease for parents who are, maybe their other parent died. And so now they're a solo parent, and there can be like, phew, I don't have to worry about getting kids to school and dealing with homework. But for other families, it can be really stressful, that lack of
Yep.
structure that happens.
Yeah. Yeah. For a solo parent, I can imagine that. Yeah, that'd be stressful. Kids out of school
Oh,
and working and trying to juggle that stuff. Yeah.
exactly. And then for kids, the structure of school can sometimes be reassuring to them. So now maybe having to do a little extra work around figuring out what's your day going to look like? What's your week going to
Yeah.
look like? And then here in Oregon, I don't know about everywhere else in the country, but it's definitely the season of weddings,
Yes.
which again can bring up a whole bunch of stuff for people who are
Yep.
grieving.
Before we go on, let me just note that we cranked through a high level thing, and we cranked through a couple of scenarios over two specific seasons, and Jenna, you'll walk us through fall and winter too, I guess. But for listeners, we'll have this stuff up on the show notes. We'll make sure that all these little tips are up there for you to review at Dougie.org. So anyway, sorry, Jenna. What about fall?
That's okay. You were still living in summer
Oh
for a
man,
while. You weren't ready for
all
me to
year
take you
long.
out of there
Yeah.
yet. So for fall, some of the things coming up, the days are getting darker. Halloween and all the imagery that comes with that around death and gravestones and things like that. So that's something to be kind of aware of if you have people in your life who are grieving, and for those of you who are grieving. And then, as we talked about in spring, it's like the season of growth and change in
Hmm.
life. And then in fall, you've got the sounds and the smells of things that are ending.
Yeah.
So that's another thing that'll be
One thing
happening.
that ended
And
for
then
me
think,
was my love of candy corn in fall because I ate way too much candy corn from my great grandma's little dish, and I can't look at it the same ever since.
that was no more candy corn. And then was that connected with your great
Yeah, so whenever
grandmother as
yeah,
well?
absolutely. Whenever I see candy corn now, I have two feelings, right? One is, boy, I don't like candy corn, but I also think about my great grandma, and I remember her face and her voice and her dry skin and all that stuff. Yeah,
All right, so you just never know where the connectors could
yeah,
be for those memories for
yeah.
people. And then we have Thanksgiving, just another oftentimes family oriented holiday. And then we head into winter, and it's cold out. People are kind of hunkering down. Maybe there's some annual holiday related trips that people used to take. And here in Portland specifically, and I feel like I remember this from growing up on the East Coast, there can be a lot of solidarity in the
Yeah,
community
right,
around complaining about the weather.
right.
And for some people who are grieving, that feels reassuring. Like, oh, good, everyone else feels bad
Yeah,
too. So I'm not alone in this, and I feel less isolated. So it's an interesting time because, the myth out there is that winter's the hardest season for depression and for, higher rates of suicide. But in reality, it turns out it's actually the spring, that April,
mm,
and depending on where you are in North America with sunlight and all of that. But right around April, May, June tend to be some of the highest levels of
is that right?
suicide, which is usually very surprising to people. They think of it as the holidays. And that's a
Yeah,
whole other podcast we could talk
yeah.
about. But just to offer to people that if you're not feeling so great about the advent of spring, you're not alone in that.
Hmm, that's really interesting. I think Donna had a podcast episode, maybe the one just prior to this one, or a couple prior, about suicide statistics and some of the kind of broad outlines of that. And I think she's queuing up follow on to that one. And maybe she'll talk a little bit about some of those
Go a
stats.
little
Yeah,
more
yeah,
detail into that. So I'm thinking we talk a little bit about, what can people do who are grieving when you're kind of moving from season to season, and the dissonance maybe from what they're feeling on the
right.
inside versus what the general community is expressing. And as we said before, just knowing that this is a common experience can bring a lot of relief. and knowing that people are not alone and not having to feel like they are bringing other people down, if they're
Right.
not on the bandwagon for the springtime frenzy.
Yeah.
We talked about if you're caring for a grieving child or teen, it's really helpful to open up a conversation about seasonal memories,
Hmm.
help them know if there's things they want to keep, or maybe there's traditions they want to skip. Like, I just can't do softball this year. It's too painful. I'll think about it again next year. And making that okay for them to make those
Okay.
decisions in that way.
Okay.
Um, and then I want to talk quickly about an activity I've been doing with some of the kid
Okay.
groups. It's called an I Remember poem, and we'll put the outline for the poem in the show notes. But it can be a really easy way for kids who are like, I don't write poetry, I'm terrible at it. This is a real simple one. And they just fill in the blank of in the summer, I remember, in the fall, in the winter, in the spring. And each time they just say something or a few things that they remember. And this can be a great activity to do together as a family
Yeah.
so that you can see what does mom remember that I don't remember, and what I know that my brother doesn't know.
So do you share those poems with each other, or do you post them on the back of the wall or the door, or what do you do? What?
That's going to be real individual to each
Yeah.
family, right? So if you're the kind of family where people want to talk openly, or maybe it's something where everybody gets the poem and they go fill it out in their own quiet corner and they keep it to
Mm-hmm.
themselves. So, not definitely not wanting to insist that kids share if they're not comfortable with that.
Yeah. I guess that would be pretty individualized. Anything else you wanna share?
Yeah. A couple other things that people have been talking about is, once you identify what were the activities or the hobbies that you used to do in a particular season, and maybe they're ones that you want to stay connected to. So think about how else can you find a way to do that. So maybe you join a
Oh
gardening
yeah.
club or go on a hiking trip with some friends, or you join a book club, anything like that, so that you don't, if you're not able to do that with the person who died, you can still stay connected to that particular activity. And then a new one for me I was thinking about is if people are into music, like sometimes music can really help us
Yep.
connect to our memories and our
Yep.
emotions, and sometimes it can provide a really nice exit from that. And think about making a playlist for each season. So it's something you can turn to of like, here's my summer road trip playlist, or
Yeah.
here's my winter hunker down
Right.
playlist.
Well,
And then just for now with the spring and hopefully people thawing, I know Boston might still be under snow, but if the thaw is happening where you live, to think about just getting outside and moving your body, any kind of
yeah.
exercise.
Shaking off the cobwebs a little bit. I think I
Hmm.
remember you saying something back to the music playlist piece. Have you? Maybe I'm thinking of somebody else, but it seems like you might have talked about having two playlists: one that remembers a person and one that I don't know something else. Well, I don't remember what you said, but seemed like one playlist that was like favorite songs, and another that helps you. I don't know.
Right. No, totally. So, if you've got the experience of like, oh, I really want to connect to my emotional experience around this grief, and then you've got that playlist, right?
Yeah.
Like, whatever those songs are that are going to maybe bring up some tears or create an experience that way. And maybe that's not the playlist you put in when you have a really stressful drive.
Right.
Maybe you create a playlist for I need to just like focus and get
Yeah.
distracted and lighten the load a little bit in some way.
That's good. Well, that's a lot of stuff, and I will make sure we get all of these tips up on the show notes page, dougie.org. Thanks for listening, everybody. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter, and our username is the Dougie Center, all one word. And we want to answer your questions about grief and loss, so send them to us. help@dougie.org, and maybe put the word podcast in the subject line somewhere so we can filter those questions out a little easier. And if you're listening to this on iTunes, there's the little stars that you can push, and 5 stars means awesome, and 1 star means need some help. But if you could give us a little rating with that star system, that'd be super great because it helps everybody else who's looking for a podcast like this one to find it. It just helps us rank better in search on iTunes. So we'd love it if you would give us some star rankings. That'd be really great. So, Jenna, thanks for talking.
Thanks, Brendan. Look forward to talking with you next week for the next
Right
episode.
on. See you later.
Take care.
Thanks for listening.